Get that explosion and fire. Fire!
When analyzing the battle strategies of Starfleet, it can be somewhat confusing, as the culture of the pseudo-military organization is reflective of the civilian culture, which exists in its various states based on how well Starfleet does. In the 22nd century, the Federation was barely formed, so the various fleets did the individual heavy lifting depending on the species' vessels themselves. The early to mid-23rd century saw a federalized and uniform Starfleet, especially when it comes to its vessels, but due to the powerhouses of the Alpha Quadrant coming together and not being challenged, early Starfleet was somewhat lax on defensive measures. One nearly lost Klingon war later, in the mid to late 23rd century, saw a more militaristic organization, which results in the civilian arm becoming progressive and, again, anti-war, which then leads to lax defensive measures on Starfleet's end in early to mid 24th century that would then show them being face-to-face with the Borg and the Romulans, and you get the drill. So let's go a little bit more in depth.
Genesis was perfectly named, the creation of life, not death.
As stated, Starfleet is simply an arm of the United Federation of Planets, and, well, the UFP, that is a supranational interstellar union of multiple planetary nation-states that operate semi-autonomously under a single central government, founded on the principles of liberty, equality, peace, justice, and progress, with the purpose of furthering the universal rights of all sentient life. What the... That is not just on Memory Alpha, that is in their charter, and they say it in the show. Jesus Christ. More pragmatically, the Federation is simply the civilian body and citizenry that decided to equally coexist and come together for the common defense. Like any civilization, their values would reflect and inform that of their science and military arm. The will of the civilians would instruct that of Starfleet. Sometimes that meant Starfleet was better for it, and sometimes it meant that Starfleet was worse for the wear. Interestingly, or perhaps predictably, the worse the threat to the civilians, or the more scared the populace became, the more leeway that would be granted to Starfleet, which would result in both positive and negative consequences. But that all comes down to, well, the culture of Starfleet as well.
The first duty of every Starfleet officer is to the truth, whether it's scientific truth, or historical truth, or personal truth. It is the guiding principle on which Starfleet is based.
Unlike many other aspects of the organization, the culture of the fleet is generally the same throughout time, with arguably only 2 wars and 1 era showing any distinct differences. Starfleet, generally, has always looked at itself as both a scientific arm of the Federation as well as an entity to provide for the common defense. Whether it was through the blood-soaked era of the 22nd century, the hardened warriors of the mid to late 23rd century, or even the ignorant explorers of the early 24th, they all saw themselves as scientists along with being anything else. Additionally, Starfleet was considered to be the best of the best, the pinnacle of humanity, of Vulcan and other species. These would be the ones to travel into the stars and to boldly go where no one has gone before. Of course, this society within a society would have its bad apples, and even for those who were the pinnacle, the top, as with any culture, when they were pushed to the thin ice, they would bend, they would compromise, and possibly even break, but they would always come through. On that note,
Starfleet is not a military organization. Its purpose is exploration. I decided that my officers and I needed to hone our tactical skills. In a crisis situation, it is prudent to have several options.
The problem with those who analyze this quote-unquote scientific organization is that they look at them through a lens of their current year circumstances and not the lens of which Starfleet exists. Starfleet, starting even at its beginning, was a group of people who are idealists. From the 22nd century and on, they would always have a mentality of expecting the universe to largely have their values. That is, the values of curious explorers. Again, there are exceptions to this rule, but generally, that's what they thought they would encounter. Now, this would be challenged after the Federation's Golden Era and into the Borg and Dominion Wars, and indeed the mentality would be modified, but for the most part, there always was the spirit of accepting everything with an open hand and open mind. Arguably, even into the 25th century, this was still something largely enjoyed by most Starfleet officers individually, even if outright rejected by Starfleet Command. This would completely go away around the 31st to 32nd century, but we'll get there when we get there. All of that to say this.
I appreciate your directness. Now let me be direct with you. The mines stay. I will not allow any more Dominion reinforcements through the wormhole.
You will not allow?
You heard me.
There exists a piece of beta canon that reflects most all of the alpha canon, and I wish so much that it had been canonized on screen. In beta canon, Starfleet diplomacy is largely summed up like this. The Federation will never be the one to throw the first punch, but Starfleet will ensure that the second punch guarantees that it's the last one. Starfleet personnel are idealists. They look at themselves as scientists and peacekeepers, even in the mid to late 24th century. The military will always do scientific research and wish that that was its sole purpose. They also are willing to sacrifice themselves in a fight, even when justified to do otherwise. So when looking at their tactics, we have to accept that they are willing to let their people die in a lot of situations for their ideals. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the type of vessels that they would create.
Well, it's a new ship, but she's got the right name. Now, you remember that, you hear?
I will, sir.
You treat her like a lady, and she'll always bring you home.
Without looking at specific designs, the type of Starfleet ships that are created come down to three distinct types depending on the era. They have vessels with a focus on exploration and scientific research, vessels with a focus on common defense, and a mishmash of the two. While arguably the combination of the two may have occurred somewhat in the mid to late 23rd century, it most definitively was a staple from the mid 24th century on. During the other various eras, the vessels would seemingly serve one specific function or another. This doesn't mean that scientific ships couldn't defend themselves, nor that combat vessels couldn't engage in scientific endeavors, just that they appeared to lean heavily one way or the other. This ultimately dictated the tactics of the Starfleet within the era that it existed. With that out of the way, let's look at the different tactics of Starfleet throughout the different centuries.
Stand by phase cannons. Don't fire until I give the order.
The 22nd century saw the coalition of planets and ultimately the Federation. This would effectively be the only time that various ships would have to work in tandem. The tactics of Starfleet would play to the strengths of the various vessels they had available. We don't have a lot of information or knowledge of these ships, but in theory, human vessels would probably utilize their sensors and photonic torpedoes to cause devastating damage upon the enemies. The bulk of the heavy lifting when it comes to fights would probably be the Andorian and Vulcan ships that have been crafted originally to fight each other. The use of their shielding technology as well as military tactics would play a vital role in the battles to come. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information on the Tellarites, but we do know that they were able to stand up against the Andorians. So it's possible that the Tellarites and human ships would be a first attack wave or various smaller vessels while they supported the Vulcan and Andorian ships. Also, the coalition of planets would see other species come together to join the Armada. This would mean that other vessels would probably be a part of the fighting force. However, once the coalition of planets became the Federation, it would be only the founding four members that banded together, at least originally. After the formation of the Federation, vessels would become uniform with the technologies of the various species combining to create a standard Starfleet vessel. While militia fleets still exist even into the 24th century, Starfleet ships would become known as both the scientific and military arm of all Federation citizens. Independent powers within the Alpha and Beta quadrants would be shaken by the Alliance. Effectively, an entity that could rival the Romulans and Klingon Empire had been created. The Federation would soon begin accepting more and more members, and slowly but surely they would become near unrivaled and start to focus on exploration and scientific endeavors. Unfortunately, they would forget what it took to form the Federation, and this would lead into a devastating tactical error in the early to mid 23rd century.
Battle is not a simulation. It's blood and screams and funerals. I taught you better than this.
The Starfleet of the early to mid 23rd century would be reflective of the Federation's focus on exploration and science, as I just stated. While there would be some officers that had been in combat, the majority would seemingly not have any idea what it was like, the reality of war. The defensive systems of the vessels would be ill-prepared for any coming war. Interestingly, while their technology left something to be desired, individual ships would still have support. We would see this after the USS Sinju sent out a request for help after encountering the Klingon sarcophagus vessel. While a small to moderate fleet was able to form relatively quickly, the Federation vessels were not equipped to fight the incoming invaders. When the battle began, the vessels would break off into pairs, or sometimes trios, trying to break through Klingon lines, though ultimately they would be singled out and individually picked off. This was reflective of a lack of military training for those on the individual vessels. The devastating defeat at the Battle of the Binary Stars was only the beginning. The Klingons swarmed Federation space, overrunning the forces of Starfleet that would constantly be on the retreat. With a new cloaking device, that they never call a cloaking device just to keep continuity, the Empire often would do raids upon the Federation. Starfleet vessels that were on patrol by themselves, or in small numbers, would be caught off guard and generally destroyed by cloaked vessels. The Klingons, utilizing actual military prowess, pushed their advantage and would sneak into Starfleet bases, blowing up everyone there. Starfleet would be able to counter this attack temporarily with an experimental spore drive, allowing one ship to appear anywhere in the Alpha and Beta quadrants, exacting rightful vengeance. Unfortunately, due to initial Starfleet morality, it would only be utilized with a focus on defense and trying to stop the war, but not causing any other damage, thus missing any opportunity to strike a fatal blow that would cripple the Empire. This ship, the USS Discovery, would ultimately go missing, and the Klingons would once again press their advantage. For some reason, Starfleet would never think to come up with tactics that would allow them to detect the incoming vessels. From what I can tell, they would never do anything like utilizing phaser sweeps, or somehow using science to find their enemies. The Klingons would fracture and engage in suicide runs, resulting in over a third of Starfleet being destroyed, as Klingon ships are just able to bypass defenses and explode inside specific star bases. The Federation was pushed back to its core worlds, and even with the arrival of the Discovery after it had been refound, the ability to now detect ships that are cloaked was too late. It wouldn't be until Starfleet planted a bomb in the core of Kronos and assisted in a Klingon coup that Starfleet would have a chance, and that the war would end in either a draw or Federation victory, depending on how you wanted to look at it. The tactics of the early to mid-23rd century Starfleet was sporadic at best and ill-prepared for a real battle. The blood-soaked 22nd century, with its struggles that helped bring about this enlightened age, wouldn't be remembered until after the war. But after near annihilation, the Federation finally learned its lesson, at least for a small time. Stay tuned as we'll conclude the Tactics of Starfleet on the next Lore Reloaded.